Hello, I'm John Adams. Recently, I was privileged to carry out an interview with Dr. Bill Webster, who is an author and an international speaker on bereavement and grief. I hope you find the interview interesting. So, I'd like to warmly welcome Dr. Bill Webster for this discussion today on bereavement awareness and support. So, firstly, thank you, Dr. Webster, for joining me this afternoon. And if you don't mind, just for those watching, to give a sort of a slight overview about yourself and your background and how you got involved in bereavement support, please.
Well, thank you very much, John. It's a privilege and a pleasure to be here with you and to share some of these ideas. I got into grief support after a personal loss. My wife died in 1983, just a young woman, died very unexpectedly of a heart attack, and it threw me for a loop, as it does with many people. And really, at the time of the funeral, everyone thought I was strong. In fact, I wasn't strong, I was numb, I was in shock. And it was some months later that the numbness wore off, and I began to experience this explosion of emotions, which seemed uncharacteristic. In fact, people said, well, come on, what's wrong with you? You were doing so well at the time of the funeral. And I'll never forget one well-intentioned person saying to me, well, come on, Bill, it's been 3 months. You ought to be over it by now. Yeah. Well, that just didn't seem right. And I now know that it's not right, because you don't get over it, you get through it. But I decided that there was something missing. And so I went back to University of Toronto. My wife was Canadian, and that's what brought me over from Bonnie, Scotland, and then from London. And I still live in Canada, but I come to Britain many times, as you know. But I went back to University of Toronto and said, I'd like to do my doctorate in the area of grief support. And they said, what? They never heard of it. Thanatology wasn't even on the syllabus. So they said, and this was quite wonderful, they said, you go into the university, you've got to do so many courses, you've got to write a thesis, you've got to do a project, and convince us it's worth a doctorate. So I approached the local funeral home, and they were kind enough to say, well, okay, yeah, that would be great. And I started a community support group. And I've developed that model over the years since I graduated, and that model has now become a model that we use in Canada and in the United States, and also in the UK, in a number of communities and areas.
Amazing. If I just jump in there, Bill, sorry to interrupt you, but so you mentioned that you got in touch with that funeral home in Canada where you live now. What year was that, please?
That was in 1986.
1986, so that's 36 years ago.
My goodness, and I only look like I'm 40.
Well, I'm sorry to tell you, but that's the year I was born.
That's right. Make me feel good, John. That's okay.
Sorry. But the reason why I asked the question was, so we're starting for ourselves now. So we have bereavement support after a funeral service, and many funeral homes across the United Kingdom are starting to do this now.
That's right.
But it's not a recent thing here. So you're quite forward thinking in doing it in 1986, quite ahead of the curve, really. So, and what made you see that then? What made you understand that, and why the importance of that was there back then?
Well, just because of my own personal experience. I thought, if I'm experiencing confusion and lack of concentration, if I feel like I'm falling apart, if I'm feeling that my world has been turned upside down and people are saying, come on, get over it, get on with it, you're strong, you got to pull yourself together, and all these cliches that people use, I thought there's something missing here. So it was out of my own need. And then having worked through that, I began to recognize that, hey, this is what everybody experiences, it's not just me. And so I think it was out of that personal experience that the program came. Now, over these 36 years, I've developed my program. I look back on it, it was pretty simplistic, but I've developed it into a much more complex and yet manageable program.
Amazing. Well done to what you've done. I said your courses now are everywhere and across the UK and in America, Canada, and worldwide. So thank you for what you've done. And obviously today I'm really interested to get your thoughts and your views on sort of the future of bereavement support. And obviously and you and I have discussed about the initiative about seeing bereavement awareness being incorporated into the national curriculum, so we'll touch on that as well. But so I know why you've done what you've done, but what is your thoughts then on where the bereavement support goes in the future? Where do you see it moving to through your eyes?
Well, I think, John, that's a great question. I think we're really at a bit of a crossroads because, it's been 50 years since Kubler-Ross came out with her famous book and the 5 stages and all that kind of stuff. And there's been various developments in terms of understanding bereavement and so on. But just in March of this year, 2022, the American Psychiatric Association actually developed DSM-5, the Diagnostical and Statistical Manual of Mental Health Disorders, which for the very first time has proclaimed grief as a mental health disorder. It's actually prolonged grief disorder. Now, that involves people whose grief is prolonged, but I think the thing that I struggle with is that they define that as being 1 year.
Okay.
My son died 4 years ago. And you'll be surprised to hear me say, I'm not over it. I'll never be over it.
No.
There are specific designations that say that, yes, some people's grief can be complicated, traumatic, prolonged. And yes, there is a need. There is a real need for professionals to come in and to deliver counseling and strategies and so on. However, I feel the danger is that we're going to abdicate grief support to the professionals. And while I'm not knocking professional counselors, I am one. But I think there are specific needs that demand professional counseling, and a lot of people who really do very well in community support, just like you do, and many other funeral directors do. I think we need to reclaim that, and I think that's the crossroads that we're at. And which way is it going to go? Because, to be honest with you, many people can't afford professional counseling. And so I'm always trying to see how we can provide this without expense and so on to the person.
So you're sort of saying as well then that we just need to have a better understanding within our own communities really to provide that care and support, not have to rely on professionals, just pull together more.
John, you're asking some great questions. It was interesting. I actually wrote down a quote here from the American Psychiatric Medical Director who said this: especially now, sharing information and increasing awareness about grief disorder is essential. Now, I would maybe disagree with the word disorder, but I think if we apply that principle, sharing information, increasing awareness about grief is essential. Not a year down the road when it becomes complicated, but right from the beginning, right from the time of the funeral.
Okay, so that brings me to my next question then to you. So I'm a believer in preparation, and so we're saying the point of contact is when, and bereavement support starts, is when when someone suffers trauma or a loss. With the initiative about the bereavement support and bereavement awareness being incorporated into national curriculum, my suggestion is that we actually prepare people before they suffer trauma, and to have a basic understanding in schools about when loss takes place, what that person will go through, giving some understanding and some compassion to the people in the class, supporting the teacher in signposting, and hopefully, I believe, will create a more positive society. What's your thoughts? Do you see any negatives with this? What's your view?
Well, I agree with what you say, but it's how we put it into practice is going to be the key. Because one of my best friends is a life insurance agent, and his statement always is, nobody wants life insurance until they need it, and then they can't get it. And I think, yeah, it's good to prepare people, and good for there to be education and all the rest of it. But people don't really go for it until they need it. That's the difficulty. And so, I mean, I think that we need to be ready, however, in a very practical way to help people deal with loss when they feel the need, until people feel the need. Now, you mentioned education in the schools. I think that would be absolutely excellent. It's interesting, 100 years ago, everybody talked about death and nobody talked about sex.
Yeah.
How far we've come in the last century. Because yes, we have sex education and education about just about everything in schools, but do we have loss education? Now, I want to be careful in that, because I think many children suffer many losses, not just the death of a grandparent or a parent, but also divorce, separation, moving away, and it's helping people understand that the feeling of loss. Well, it depends on how we define trauma, John. I don't want to get too technical here. Everything is traumatic for the person who's going through it, but there is a clinical definition of trauma. So, and so we have to be kind of careful about that. I mean, I think it's personally traumatic. There's no doubt about it. And how can we do that? But again, that doesn't have to fall into the area of mental health disorder, because the first essential in trauma is, believe it or not, empathy, stabilization. So when you hear that there's been a shooting in a school, or a traumatic incident, a suicide, or a rash of suicides, and grief counselors are on site. I'm a grief counselor. I believe in grief counseling. But is crisis management is necessary at that point. And the first element of crisis management is stabilization, getting some structure back into it, because until people feel safe, they're not going to go down the road. And that, so I've written, my books are not academic per se. My books are for the grieving people. And it kind of eases people into understanding the process, because empathy leads to education. Understanding. You can't have one without the other, because people are going to say, not how, do you have a PhD, or how many books have you written? They look at me and they say, do you have any idea what I'm going through? And when I can share that with them, they say, this guy knows what he's talking about because he's been there. Now, that's not necessarily always true, because there are some people who think they're experts just because they've had the experience. As T.S. Eliot once said, we can have the experience, but miss the meaning. And so empathy leads to education, which leads to expression, or, because once I understand I'm normal, once I understand this isn't a mental health disorder, I'm not going crazy, people that are able to express it. Yeah,
no, I totally agree. And back to obviously that national curriculum again. I mean, we say about how you don't need it until you're in that situation. But with the information that I've got here, the research, like 80% of people will suffer a loss before the age of 18. And even when there's a high profile death in the communities, that can affect lots of people. So preparation surely will help people moving forward.
Listen, John, I'm not disagreeing with you in the slightest. I'm just saying the key is to help people realize that there's a need ahead of the event. You and I, in our various professions, we recognize that there's a need, and boy, it would be nice to prepare people for this. But I think because we live in a still live in a loss-denying culture, if we want to put it that way, people often don't want to think about it until it slaps them in the face. And
you mentioned about sex education as well. I think what's interesting, that not everybody will have sex, but unfortunately, everyone will die. And again, I find that fascinating, that we can't, why is our relationship, why are we in this position with our relationship with death? Why are we so distant from it?
Because it's a taboo, John. And a taboo, by definition, is a secret that everybody knows, but nobody wants to talk about, right? So death, we don't want to think about death. I mean, we don't want to think about loss. We live in a prosperity society. So we don't want to think about lose. So when the stock market goes down, or we have a financial reversal, or something happens, people panic because they're not prepared, because they haven't wanted to think about it. They've been living in this ideal world. So I think we need to sort of start somewhere to sort of say, look, in the event that, and I think that can be done. But I still think that we have to be ready with a program that when it happens, that's when people are going to say, oh my goodness, what was it that they were talking about? Let's go back and take a look at that. So to put it into place and have it there for people when they need it.
Yeah, and again, over the last two and a half years of COVID, seeing numbers on the screen at home, how many deaths that a day, again, it's that understanding about what each number represents. It's not just one death, it's each family behind each number. So again, if we had a bit more of an understanding about this, I think it could be such a positive thing.
I have no issue with that whatsoever, John. I think you're right on the mark. Again, I think it's just simply a matter of making these resources available. You can lead a horse to water.
Yeah.
Break. And that, again, that's all I'm really saying. So I think we have to prepare the pool, as it were, of information and program and strategy, and then when at the time of need. And you're right, because I think COVID affected some people. Some people were on a life raft, and other people were on a cruise ship. Because I think it affected different people in different ways. So the people whose loved ones were in a nursing home dying and they couldn't get it affected them much more profoundly than people who were observing it on TV and so on.
I even saw it. So with what I do in arranging and conducting funeral services, and people in the community know what I do, but I usually don't get asked questions about what I do. But during COVID, I noticed people needed to know what's happening. And obviously I wouldn't say anything to them in detail, but the lines were blurred almost, and death was a lot closer to people.
Absolutely.
So I'm hopeful that we can learn from it and take it with us and take the positives from it, really.
Once again, you've raised something that I think is very important, and it's this, that I think COVID has confronted a lot of people with their own mortality.
Yeah.
It's not just my loved ones can die, I could die. My children could die. And I think that it's often when we're confronted with our own death that we begin to sort of see life differently. We start to recognize priorities. And people, I think, have learned a lot in the last 2 years of what's really important. It's a lot of this other stuff, but what's really important. And so hopefully we can build on some of that, because I think all of us, people going to work, people like yourself, John, people in front line, doctors, nurses, care workers, and so on, going to work every day and saying, this job could be the death of me.
Yeah.
And I think for the first time in a long, long time, that has been brought home to people. So I think building on stuff like that is very important.
So I recently attended a meeting where they presented research on bereavement support throughout the UK, and it was highlighted where areas and pockets of the UK where they are struggling with bereavement support for families, there is now a rise and increase in prescription drugs to those people. What are your thoughts? Obviously, we have to be careful with this, but do you think there are negatives in using these types of drugs as an aid, or do you think it's justified?
I really can't comment on that because I'm not a medical doctor and it's not appropriate for me. I think I would only say this, that I think that when people recognize that grief is normal, when they have the opportunity to feel empathy, to receive education, to have an opportunity to express their emotions and talk it out, when they feel empowered to live life as it now is, when they have emotional, educational, and social support. And that's why I'm such a great believer in community grief support, because it's not like coming on once a week. It's not like having a session once a month of whatever. It's an ongoing community. And I think we need to get back to dealing with this in the community, because while, of course, how could I say that the most important part of my program is not Dr. Bill Webster? How could I say that? But I'm saying that because the most important part of that is that I create an environment in which people support one another, in which people talk to one another, in which people share and express emotions and feel safe, and then go out to dinner.
Yeah.
This part of grief support is they're lonely. They don't have people that they can do social things with. And so I think a national strategy really should be a comprehensive program. It's not just talking on the telephone. It's not just talking on Zoom. It's not just going to a professional counselor, because even after professional counseling ends, and if it's not inappropriate, even after antidepressants end, now what?
Yeah.
We have to put things into place. Again, I'm not a medical doctor. I'm not commenting on the use of medications, antidepressants. I'm just saying that we need to help people rebuild their lives.
Direction and purpose is that.
To find the confidence to go on.
Yeah. And direction and purpose, isn't it really? So
exactly. They need to rediscover themselves.
Yeah.
And rediscover a sense of meaning for their lives. The circumstances may never make any sense, John. My son died tragically 4 years ago. It'll never make sense. The circumstances will never make sense. But I'm determined to make my life meaningful, even in the light of that tragedy. And that's really what my continuation in grief support's all about. It's my legacy. I want to make a difference. And I think that there are people who may benefit from some of these programs that we're talking about who will say, yeah, I need to do that. Because a lot of people who get involved in grief support have come through it themselves and say, now I want to help others. And I think that's...
So I haven't mentioned to you, but I lost my mother at the age of 12.
I'm sorry.
And it's again though, it's about, that sadness and sort of bad time doesn't define me. I want that to define me. The opposite for me, I use it as fuel for myself, to push me on. And that's a big driving force behind me really in doing what I'm trying to achieve. So again, it's how we use these bad times, isn't it really? So
John, that's what I call survival. And you know what the word survive means? The word survive means to live beyond. And that's really the goal for grief support, to help people live beyond the experience of loss that they've had.
That's brilliant. Well, I think that's a great time to call an end to the meeting, Bill, and just want to say thank you so much for joining us from Canada. And it's great to speak to you and to learn from you. And I'll put a link on here as well about the courses that you provide. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much, John. It's been a privilege, and let me know how I could be of any assistance whatsoever.
Thanks so much. Take care.